When a coalition of criminal organizations has a problem that they need eliminated, how can they do so without starting a massive war between the factions involved? This was the issue faced by the National Crime Syndicate, an association of primarily Italian and Jewish gangsters based out of New York City. So they established a team of assassins based in Brooklyn. Using ice picks, firearms, knives, and even drowning to dispatch their targets, this enforcement arm of the syndicate was prolific, with an estimated 400 to 1,000 victims in the short time it was active. This network of hitmen was headed by Louis Lepke Buchalter and the man who would become the face of the organization, Umberto Albert Anastasia, otherwise known as the Lord High Executioner. The National Crime Syndicate was formed in 1929 as the brainchild of Johnny Torrio in an effort to organize so that the criminals could maximize the profits that were rolling in as a result of the massive expansion of bootlegging due to Prohibition. Torrio met with other leaders in Atlantic City in May of 1929 with a roster that included infamous men such as Charles Lucky Luciano, Al Capone, Bugsy Siegel, Louis Buchalter, Nucky Thompson, who operated a corrupt political organization in the city, Umberto Anastasia, and many more. One of the problems that the syndicate faced was conflict within the organization. They needed an enforcement arm to handle any such situations. If someone needed to be eliminated, the case was brought before the leadership, referred to as the Commission, who would vote in favor or against the action. If individual gangs were to commit these crimes themselves, there was a higher likelihood of revenge attacks and the potential for a total collapse of the alliance and all-out war. Having a specialized crew of hitmen on hand would minimize violence and help to make the most out of the syndicate members' illegal operations. After all, war is bad for business. And as nations discovered many years ago, a standing army has its own benefits. It reduced the time it took to rally your troops, but it also led to the soldiers becoming more effective as they were able to focus on honing their skills. Before the syndicate was formed, there were pretty strict divisions between gangs along ethnic lines, but that limited their earning potential and the ability to take full advantage of the environment that Prohibition had created. Prohibition made alcohol illegal in the United States from 1920 to 1933. But of course, this did not mean that drinking stopped overnight. Instead, it allowed criminals to rake in huge amounts of money selling illegal liquor. Al Capone alone is said to have taken in the equivalent of $1 billion a year in today's money. So the Commission tasked the small organization that had been started by Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel with such eliminations. Control was passed to Louis Lepke Buchalter and Umberto Anastasia, who assembled teams of assassins based out of Brooklyn. These men would be paid a salary as well as bonuses for carrying out hits rather than being paid on a strictly per-contract basis as is typical with hitmen. Some of the notable names in this bunch were Abe Reles, Harry Philadelphia Phil Strauss, who was said to have been the most prolific with hundreds of suspected hits, Frank Abbandando, Louis Capone, Harry Mayoni, and Martin Goldstein. These men and many more would be dispatched to outside cities to handle sensitive business with the advantage of being unknown to the victims and the local authorities. Almost every single one of the people who would be targeted by what would become known as Murder Inc. was an informant or a mobster who had stolen money from the syndicate. Such was the case of Abraham Wagner in 1932. The 26-year-old had built a business for himself selling booze and narcotics with his brother on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. But the game had changed and had become more violent, yet Wagner was reluctant to follow suit. After surviving an assassination attempt on a crowded street, Wagner sent his brother to broker a peace with the rival Mazza gang. Instead of an end to the bloodshed, Wagner lost his brother to this ruthless competition. At that point, he gave up and he and his wife Goldie packed their bags. On their way out of town, Abe went to the police and gave them information on his rivals. The couple would end up in St. Paul, Minnesota, where, under a new name, Abe ran a fruit stand. But back in New York, his trip to the police would not go unforgotten. He had broken one of the cardinal rules, and two men, George Young and Joseph Schaefer, were dispatched to Minnesota once word got back to the bosses where Wagner was hiding. The pair ambushed Abe and shot him 7 times as he ate dinner, then began pistol whipping him. Their concern was the punishment, not their own freedom, and they were quickly apprehended. While the tentacles of the syndicate ran deep, they were not able to shield Young and Schaefer from justice. Instead of the death penalty, however, the two men received life in prison, which would be served out at Stillwater Penitentiary. Before they worked for the syndicate, the hitmen from Brooklyn had been part of different factions vying for control. Abe Kid Twist Reles, Harry Strauss, and Martin Goldstein had been working for three brothers, Meyer, Irving, and Willie Shapiro, who controlled most of Brownsville. Reles decided with his two friends that they deserved a bigger slice of the pie that the gang was taking in from their slot machine, loan sharking, prostitution, and union operations. The brothers were not pleased when they learned that some of their employees were running their own money-making schemes for themselves. They knew that something had to be done or their empire would begin to fall apart. A trap was set and Reles and Goldstein were lured to the Shapiro's headquarters with a third man named George DeFeo. Instead of finding their targets, the three men were met with a hail of bullets. They were able to escape, but both Reles and Goldstein had been wounded. Not only that, but as the ambush took place, Meyer Shapiro abducted Reles' girlfriend and assaulted her. This brutal attack infuriated Reles even more, fueling his need for revenge. The three men knew that they had to act quick or the Shapiros would take them out of the game permanently. Fortunately for them, they had connections to Meyer Lansky through associates of DeFeo, and Reles reached out to one of their competitors, Harry Maoni, and his crew, who were more than happy to coordinate to topple the Shapiro's Brownsville empire. The newly formed alliance created a vicious bunch of assassins that would be more than useful to the organization that Lepke Buchhalter was creating. Abe Reles' friend, Louis Capone, talked the crew up to Albert Anastasia, who in turn discussed the usefulness of the Brownsville mobsters to Lucky Luciano. Over the next few years, they hunted down the three Shapiro brothers one by one, though there are some reports of a drive-by perpetuated by the Shapiros on a pool hall owned by Martin Goldstein before this. Reles is said to have looked out and seen the brothers shooting from their car. This last attempt at holding onto power failed, and soon the Shapiros were eliminated by the newly formed group that referred to themselves as the Combination. First, the Combination found 27-year-old Irving. They had learned the location of one of their target's apartments, and on July 11, 1931, they moved on it. Irving returned home, and as he walked up to his apartment, he found the lights were off in the hallway. As Irving walked up to his front door, Reles and Goldstein emerged from the shadows and opened fire. As Irving crumpled, Abe grabbed him and dragged him out into the street, where he shot him several more times before leaving him in plain view. The gang caught up with 22-year-old Meyer on September 17, 1931, as he drank in one of Manhattan's speakeasies. Reles, Maoni, and Goldstein grabbed him and threw him into a car. They took Meyer to the cellar of an apartment building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and shot him once through the ear, then left him there where he would be found later. Of the three brothers, Willie would have the worst end. When they caught him on July 20, 1934, he was 23 years old. A witness would report seeing a suspicious group of men filling in a hole in the marshy area of the Canarsie neighborhood of Brooklyn. When authorities came and dug up the hole, they found the badly beaten remains of young Willie. The investigation found dirt in his lungs, indicating that he was buried alive. It is believed that the perpetrators of this crime were Reles, Maoni, Abbandando, and the Amberg brothers, Louis, Joseph, and Hyman. The Amberg brothers had built their own reputation in the Brooklyn underworld, and as an interesting side note, Joseph and Louis Amberg would meet their own ends not long after what they did to Willie Shapiro. On September 30th of 1935, Joseph and his driver, a man named Morris Kessler, were pulled from their vehicle by three gunmen, one wearing a suit and the other two in mechanics' overalls. The unknown assailants lined them up against a wall and gunned them down, then fled. The suited man drove away in a stolen car, which was found later with two firearms in the back seat. Joseph's brother, Louis, who went by Pretty on the street, had an even more violent demise. On October 23, 1935, just weeks after the assassination of his brother, police were just starting to relax the surveillance of the Amberg gang. They had expected Louis to retaliate. But on the morning of that fateful day, the opposite would happen. Police were called to the scene of a car fire in Brooklyn. Inside, they found Louis stripped with a bag over his head and his hands tied with metal wire. The cause of death was a shotgun blast and axe blows. This crime has been attributed to Murder Inc., and incidentally occurred the day before the assassination of infamous crime boss Dutch Schultz. Speaking of Schultz, he too crossed paths with Murder Inc., but his execution was no simple revenge plot as in the case of the Shapiros. This order came from the Commission. There had been an ongoing legal battle between a prosecutor named Thomas Dewey and organized crime. Many victims of the syndicate's enforcement wing had turned informant to help Dewey, which led them to be targeted. Schultz's legal problems were worse than many other mobsters in 1935. He had drained a huge amount of money into his legal fund, and his organization was tired of seeing their profits go to pay his lawyers and court costs. After Luciano made a move that looked very much like he was assuming control of Schultz's organization, the embattled gangster was getting desperate. In a last-ditch effort to avoid prosecution, Dutch proposed the assassination of Thomas Dewey himself. Fearing that he was becoming a loose cannon, the Commission rejected the proposal in favor of eliminating Schultz instead. On October 24, 1935, gunmen Mendy Weiss and Charles Workman tracked him down at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. Schultz had been eating with his accountant Otto Berman, his newly promoted lieutenant Abe Landau, and his bodyguard Bernard Rosenkrantz. Workman and Weiss entered through the back door and opened fire. Berman collapsed immediately. Landau was hit in the carotid artery, and Rosenkrantz was hit several times, but the two conscious gangsters stood and returned fire. Schultz, who had been in the bathroom, staggered to the table shouting for an ambulance. He had been hit in the abdomen in the crossfire. Weiss and Workman fled, chased out of the restaurant by Landau, who eventually collapsed into a trash can. When the first paramedics arrived, they rushed the most injured to the hospital. Dutch would wait at the restaurant sipping brandy to dull the pain. Berman was the first to pass just after 2 a.m. the next morning. A few hours later, Landau succumbed to blood loss. Though it appeared that Schultz would survive his injuries, he expired after surgery. Rosenkrantz clung to life for more than a day despite multiple bullet wounds before finally passing away. Weiss would end up in the electric chair for another crime in 1944, while Workman was sentenced to 23 years for his part in the Chop House shootout in 1941. One of the most brutal crimes of the organization was the 1937 execution of George Rudnick. The loan shark was suspected of being an informant, so on May 11th he was taken for a ride in a stolen car. He was accompanied by Harry Mayoni, Frank Abbandando, and Harry Strauss. When his body was found, he had dozens of stab wounds from an ice pick, and a meat cleaver had been used on his head. There are too many crimes to list for this organization, but things started to fall apart in 1940. Abe Reles had been one of Murder Inc.'s most prolific hitmen, but when he was brought up on charges himself, he chose to turn rat instead of going to the electric chair. His betrayal was so shocking to the gang that when he took the stand, Harry Mayoni was brought to tears before throwing a glass at him in the courtroom. Due to the testimony given by Reles, Louis Capone, Mendy Weiss, Mayoni, Harry Strauss, Frank Abbandando, Martin Goldstein, and many more would be sent to the electric chair. But Reles would not avoid a violent end himself, despite his confession and legal protection. He had been staying at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island with police guarding his room. In the early hours of November 12th, he fell from his 6th-floor room's window. The official story is that he was trying to climb out using his bedsheets, but considering he had immunity and New York was filled with men who wanted him gone, it seems unlikely that this is what actually happened. The rumor is that Frank Costello had put together $100,000 to bribe the guards to have Reles eliminated. After all, Reles had effectively destroyed one of the syndicate's most important factions. One of the men who found him would say what would become a famous quote, "The canary could sing, but he couldn't fly." After his organization fell apart, Anastasia continued his life of crime until 1957 when he was gunned down in a Manhattan barbershop. His homicide was never solved. Louis Lepke Buchhalter was sent to the electric chair in 1944 for 4 homicides that he had orchestrated. Charles Luciano himself avoided the electric chair. He had helped the Allies during World War II by rooting out spies who were trying to infiltrate the U.S. After all, his organization controlled many of the important ports in the country. He also provided the military with important contacts in Italy prior to the Allied invasion of Sicily in what would become known as Operation Underworld. For his assistant, Luciano had his 30 to 50-year sentence for pandering commuted, and he was instead deported to Italy on February 2, 1946. This day of the year is very important, not only because it's Groundhog's Day. Can you guess why? He would eventually pass away of a heart attack in 1962 at an Italian airport. While organized crime has not disappeared, it has been broken down into smaller and often more violent factions. The money that drugs brought in created super wealthy psychopaths across the globe who value power and money over all things, even loyalty. What do you think? Was the world better off before the demise of Murder Inc. and the weakening of the Mafia?